campus. For those of you who are not familiar with the Alexander Hamilton Society, we are AU's premier principles-based economic, national security, and foreign policy organization. We have some exciting programming planned for this semester, focusing on some of the biggest questions facing policymakers, such as today's topic, U.S. strategy towards North Korea. Now, I don't doubt that we all have our own thoughts about the role the United States should be playing in the world, but I encourage all of you to listen to what the speakers are saying and to critically think about why they believe what they do and how those ideas may interact with your own. If you have a question, feel free to challenge their ideas or seek clarification this evening in the Q&A session. With that, I suspect we'll leave all a little bit smarter. That said, allow me to introduce our guests. Immediately on my right is Dr. David, all the way on the right, is Dr. David Banks. He's a professional lecturer here at American University in the School of International Service. He works mainly with the international order, great power politics, and diplomacy. He has written a book on the motivation for and political consequences of state violations of diplomatic practice, and has recently done work on using wargaming to predict the likelihood of major cyber threats. Some of his work has been published in Time, The Washington Post, and The Independent, to name a few. Welcome, Professor Banks. Joining us on the other side is Colonel Maxwell, a 30-year veteran of the United States Army. He retired in 2011 as a Special Forces Commander, with his last assignment teaching national security strategy at the National War College. Some of his posts have included commanding Special Forces in Okinawa, Japan, and Seoul, South Korea. He's also been the G3 and Chief of Staff of the United States Army Special Operations Command, and currently Joint Special Operations Task Force, Philippines. Currently, he's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, along with many other positions at organizations related to North Korea. Colonel, we're glad to have you.
Thank you very much.
And last but not least, in the middle is the Alexander Hamilton Society Executive Director, Dr. Gabe Scheinmann, who received his bachelor's degree from Harvard and both his master's and doctorate from Georgetown University. He published articles about national security and foreign policy in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Gabe, and thank you all for being here tonight.
Is this on? Can everybody hear me in the back? Raise your hand if you can't hear me. All right, great. So thank you, Kevin, very much. Thank you all for being here. This is the American University Chapter's inaugural event, so consider yourselves either all privileged or victims of being here. I guess we'll find out at the very end, but thank you all for being here. I just wanted to say one word about AHS in general before I'm kind of moving on to tonight's topic. So we're a nonprofit organization. We were founded 8 years ago, and our mission is to identify, educate, and launch young men and young women such as yourselves into foreign policy and national security careers imbued with what we call Hamiltonian principles. And you can find our principles on our website, the AlexanderHamiltonSociety.org. But in short, we stand for strong and principled American leadership and goal. And most of our programming is like this, bringing debate to college campuses where there often isn't any on many issues, but in particular on issues of foreign policy and national security. So really pleased to have both Davids, I guess two Davids, here with us tonight to discuss it. So the title of tonight's event is Mission Impossible, Paths to Peace on the Korean Peninsula. And obviously this is something that's been in the news a lot, but it's obviously also not a new issue. It's 70 years old, almost 70 years old, the Korean War. The United States was, and actually technically still is, at war with North Korea. During the Cold War, a number of incidents, including probably most dramatically in 1968, the North Korean seizure of an American naval ship that led to a fairly prolonged hostage crisis. Even in the post-Cold War, in the last 25 years, a lack of diplomatic relations. It's one of the few countries the United States still does not have, or I think never has had, diplomatic relations with to this day. And so the summit between President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un in Singapore a couple months ago, although it's promised a big breakthrough in a variety of issues, I think even in the most diplomatic ways, we have yet to see what those things are. And the things that they need breakthroughs on are a number of issues. The North Korean challenge combines a number of really difficult issues for the United States all into one. Most notably, North Korea's nuclear weapons and now ballistic missile technology that by some estimates can reach the continental United States. its proliferation of nuclear weapons, both know-how and missiles technology, whether it's to Pakistan or Syria or Iran, attacks on, lethal attacks on a U.S. treaty-bound ally, South Korea, most notably about 7 or 8 years ago, a North Korean torpedo attack against a South Korean naval vessel that killed nearly 60 sailors, various detention of American citizens over time, and last but not least, it might literally be the most repressive state on the face of the earth, an open-air concentration camp by a number of people. Now, those may be the facts, but that doesn't really help us decide what we can and how we should deal with this problem. And so our guests tonight are going to try and tackle the questions of what should U.S. policy be towards North Korea, what are our goals, how can we or should we accomplish them, can and should we seek the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which is sort of the big principle at stake, at least in these ongoing negotiations. What can we do about North Korean missiles that have the ability to target the United States and elsewhere? And what should we do about the world's most repressive regime? Should we seek regime change? Should we not? If we can, what does that look like? Is it even possible? If we don't, what does that look like? Is it even possible? Is containment an option? And I think both of our speakers here tonight are going to tackle, I think, all of those questions in a variety of ways. So enough about me. Let me explain the debate format briefly. So each speaker is going to have 7 to 10 minutes to make an opening statement, answering the broad question, what should our policy towards North Korea be and why? After that, I'll spark us off with a few questions to each of them on both their comments and some follow-ups. And after that, really turn it over to all of you, questions from the audience. So please, throughout the statements and the initial questions, please think through your questions. And when we get to that period, I'll make sure to call on you. And then we'll end with a closing statement by each speaker. So with that, I think, Mr. Maxwell, if you want to start, and I think my understanding is that if you want to do your opening statements from the podium, you're most welcome to. If you'd rather do it sitting down, that's fine. And if not, I think you and I will share this microphone, and he'll get his own, which might be an unfair advantage, but I don't know what to do about that. So thank you.
Thank you, Gabe. Thank you, Kevin, and it's great to be here. And I'm a big fan of the Alexander Hamilton Society, especially the principles. We should all read the Federalist Papers regularly, right? Is that mandatory to be a member of the society? All right, let me give you a spoiler alert. I spent a lot of time in South Korea. Actually had 5 tours in the military there. I've studied this problem for a long time, but I have to give you a caveat up front. There are no experts on Korea. I'm gonna make some statements that might sound pretty authoritative. Like I said, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the problem, trying to assess it, learning from a lot of great people that study the problem. But the fact is, North Korea is the hardest target. It's the most difficult, most opaque, and very difficult to understand. So anything I say can and should be challenged. And you absolutely have the right and the really obligation and responsibility to challenge anything that both David and I say, because there are no experts. So with that said, let me just give you some quick context. It's important to understand how we have really described North Korea's strategy. We call it the Kim family regime. The late Stephen Bradner, who was in Korea from 1955 to 2011, just passed away this last year. He was the political advisor to the commander, the United Nations commander. And he described the regime this way, as a mafia-like crime family cult. And Gabe's remarks talk about the most oppressive regime, the fact that there are maybe 200,000 Koreans living in the north who are in gulags that are these open-air prison camps, for not have conducted any kind of illegal activity, but were not found to be politically loyal. So it's a mafia-like crime family cult. The vital national interest of the regime is survival of the Kim family regime. Not survival of the nation state, not survival of the Korean people in the north, survival of the Kim family regime. The strategic aim for the regime is unification of the peninsula under northern domination. That has been, it's professed. I mean, if you read their documents, their strategic documents, you listen to their propaganda, the writings of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, unification is is the goal. It's the only way that they believe they'll guarantee regime survival. And the way they're going to achieve unification is through subversion, coercion, and the use of force. And of course, the key condition of, for them to be successful in subverting, coercing, or if necessary, using force, is to split the ROC-US alliance. The classic Sun Tzu, split your enemy's alliance. They want to get U.S. forces off the peninsula. And that part of their strategy can be really summed up as divide and conquer. Divide the alliance and conquer the ROC. So that is really the foundation of its strategy. Now, of course, the legitimacy of the regime is founded on anti-Japanese partisan warfare. Kim Il-sung is the great liberator, and he, they built this myth that he was a great guerrilla fighter, and he did command the 1st of the 88th Special Independent Sniper Brigade. But he, they've created this myth that he liberated Korea from the Japanese, and it is their destiny to liberate the entire Korean Peninsula. Now, when we think about Korea and beyond the nuclear crisis, which I'll get to, we really need to look at the entire spectrum of the threats and challenges and the problem. I like to talk about the big five. The first is war. War is always a possibility. So our combined military forces, the alliance really must deter, and of course if attacked, they're going to defend South Korea, they're going to fight and of course win. The second is regime collapse. There is the possibility that there could be internal instability and regime collapse. And those conditions are very dangerous. If those conditions threaten the regime, that could lead to a decision by Kim Jong-un to go to war. And of course, if the regime does collapse, it is very likely that there will be resistance to any foreign forces, to include South Korean forces that might go into North Korea, even to conduct humanitarian relief, and which really could make the insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan pale in comparison. Adrian Buzo calls North Korea a guerrilla dynasty, and that the country is made up of people who've been indoctrinated with the revolutionary spirit and guerrilla warfare. The third is human rights and crimes against humanity. Now, some people think we should not talk about that. We should focus on the nuclear weapons, but human rights is a national security issue. They deny human rights of the 25 million Koreans living in the north in order to remain in power, and they use Korean citizens to mine uranium. They use prisoners to mine uranium. They conduct tests of chemical and biological weapons on their citizens. Just think about Kim Jong-nam being assassinated in Malaysia with VX and nerve agent. They tested that on somebody to perfect the delivery of that. And Koreans in the north died, I'm sure, were killed in tests. So, and also, we know that focusing on human rights undermines the legitimacy of the regime, and it's actually a threat. In 2014, when the Commission of Inquiry, the United Nations, published their report, Kim Jong-un reacted to it, and because it is a threat to the regime. And so human rights, crimes against humanity, is a national security issue, and it is, of course, a moral imperative to try to solve that. So we should not separate human rights from the other problems. Fourth are the asymmetric threats. Of course, the nuclear missile program, but cyber. And we're getting ready to publish a report on North Korea's cyber-enabled economic warfare. We just indicted, the U.S. just indicted a military officer in the Reconnaissance General Bureau who did the Sony hack. A couple 100-page indictment. And if you ever get phishing emails, my colleague Matthew Haas said, as he went through the indictment, he said, I would have fallen for this. So North Korea's cyber capabilities are extremely sophisticated. And so we really need to focus on that. As well as proliferation. The weapons are being proliferated to the Middle East and Africa. You look at missiles in Pakistan, Iran, Syria, all are derived, of course, Soviet models developed by the North Koreans, perfected, and then sold to others, as well as small arms. The U.S. Navy just stopped a ship in the Gulf with a couple thousand AK-47s. It hasn't been revealed yet, but I will strongly suspect that the origin was from North Korea. Now, lastly, those are the four major threats. Lastly is unification. And unification is really the biggest challenge, and it's also the solution. And from a policy perspective, we should keep in mind that on June 30th, 2017, President Trump and President Moon, in their joint declaration, reaffirmed, and has been really reaffirmed since 2009, that the alliance end state, the goal, is peaceful unification on the peninsula. Of course, whether it's peaceful or not will really be a function of Kim Jong-un's decision-making. Now, we've had the summit, the Panmunjom and Singapore summits. There are 4 questions that I ask that we really need to think about. And the first is, has Kim Jong-un abandoned the strategy that I've outlined? The strategy of use of subversion, coercion, and force to unify the peninsula under northern domination to ensure regime survival? And has it abandoned the objective of splitting the ROC-US alliance? If the answer to those 2 questions is yes, we can proceed diplomatically. If the answer is no, that gives you a good idea. The real answer, though, is I don't know. And if you don't know for sure, from a military perspective, you always have to keep in mind that there is a threat to the north, and you can't weaken your defenses, in anticipation of, hopefully having a positive outcome. Military guys are notorious for being worst-case planners, very conservative, and of course, when you have a 1.2 million man army poised, just north of you, you want to consider that threat. So, has it abandoned its strategy? The second 2 questions are really for us, and really get at what we're talking about here. What do we want to achieve on the Korean Peninsula? And more specifically, what is the acceptable, durable political arrangement on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia that is going to serve, protect, and serve and protect our interests, U.S. interests and ROC-US alliance interests? Those are really the 2 questions that we really need to ask and answer. I ask those questions a lot of policymakers. I don't get a strong answer, but when you look at our documents, there are a lot of answers in there, as I mentioned. All right, so we've had these summits. 2 things coming out of the summits are really important. One is that both President Moon and President Trump fell for Kim Jong-un's narrative. And his narrative is denuclearization of the entire Korean Peninsula, which sounds good to us, but we have not had nuclear weapons in South Korea since 1991, when George Bush unilaterally withdrew them. And so there are no nuclear weapons in South Korea. But from Kim Jong-un's perspective, the presence of U.S. forces provides access to nuclear weapons, and so what he wants first is the withdrawal of U.S. forces. He wants U.S. forces off the peninsula, an end of the alliance, and an end of the nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan. That is the security guarantee that he really demands. And so from both summits, North Korea has a very linear process that they want to go through. First is declaration of the end of the war on the peninsula. Second is sanctions relief. Third is denuclearization of the South. And fourth is then negotiate dismantlement of the North's nuclear program. And of course, if they get the first 3 done, we're probably not going to get to the 4th, given the nature of the Kim family regime. And there are many other issues I could cover, and I'd be happy to talk during the Q&A about a peace regime, peace treaty, the status of forces in Korea, U.S. forces, the declaration of all North Korea's nuclear sites, the suspension of readiness exercises, very important issue, the reduction of guard posts in the DMZ, the ROC Liaison Office in Kaesong just announced today, and of course, how to sustain maximum pressure. All of those issues are resulting from the summits. Now, unification, and what should our policy be? I believe unification is the only answer, the only way we'll see an end to the North Korean nuclear program and the crimes against humanity being committed against the Korean people living in the North, is to unify the peninsula under what might be called a united Republic of Korea, with a secure, stable, economically vibrant, non-nuclear nation that rests on a liberal constitutional form of government determined by the Korean people. That's really the end state that we should seek to achieve. Now, how do you get there? There's really 4 paths. And just briefly, we like peaceful unification, which is also the most complex, the hardest to achieve, and unlikely that Kim Jong-un will ever capitulate to a peaceful unification process that doesn't result in him dominating the peninsula. But because it's the hardest and most complex, we should South Korea should plan for peaceful unification, and as its allied partner, we should support them in doing that. Because everything you do in that most difficult, complex process of planning for peaceful unification will have application in the other three paths to unification. The quickest path, of course, is war, which results in the destruction of the North Korean People's Army, the regime, devastation of the Northern Territories. That's the quickest way. And unfortunately, the blood and treasure that will be expended will be horrendous. The second way is, of course, regime collapse. And as I said, regime collapse could lead to a decision to go to war, those conditions. And then, if there is collapse, we're likely to see terrible problems, humanitarian problems, as well as resistance to outside forces. The fourth path is the outlier, something that we can't control, but something we should observe for. And that is internal instability that leads to the emergence of a new leader. Somebody who may be willing to want to lead a country that is a responsible member of the international community and might seek peaceful unification. And so if that emerges, all of the planning for peaceful unification might be applied in that case. And that's why I think that our policy should be seeking peaceful unification. If peaceful unification, peace can't be done in a peaceful way, we have ways to deal with the threats. But in the end, a secure, stable, peaceful, economically vibrant, non-nuclear peninsula unified under a liberal constitutional form of government determined by the Korean people, a united Republic of Korea, is really what we should seek. And I'll stop there. And much more to say, and happy to answer additional Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I want to echo Colonel Maxwell's comments and just say thank you to the Alexander Hamilton Society for having us. This is a very interesting and timely debate. I think it's great that debates are something that is being encouraged on campuses. I think it's useful to have these discussions out loud. Classrooms can be a slightly stifling environment sometimes, so it's good to have these kind of spaces. So we were asked to consider what should US policy toward North Korea be and why. And obviously this is not an unimportant question. North Korea has, as you all know, recently developed the capability to strike the United States with nuclear weapons. All measures indicate they're going to probably improve in that capability as time goes on. All previous US policies appear to have failed in that each successive wave of US attempts to sanction or somehow push North Korea into a corner have just created more space for them to be able to further develop a nuclear policy. And so here I think, we have to recognize that any choice that's going to be made is fraught with trade-offs. The French political scientist of the Cold War, Raymond Aron, had a famous quote about international politics. He said, in international politics, the choice is rarely between good and bad. It is almost always between the preferable and the detestable. And that is what we have to recognize when we make any decisions about policies. There's no real silver bullet here where the United States could probably pull some trigger and have a complete set of policies that will stack together in a way that will give them everything it wants all at the same time. If only politics was so generous, but it's not. And so I think any US choice has to begin with the reality of what trade-offs is it willing to make and what are the overall purposes or the overall goals, strategic goals that it's seeking to pursue in regards not just to Korea, but how Korea fits into larger US interests and larger US strategy. So in determining this, what can we do? I'll give you the answer now and then I'll explain how I got to it. The United States will essentially, for all intents and purposes, continue to do what it's been doing. That is to pursue a policy of containment. Now, I use the word here containment as being slightly different from what it's been doing in the past, because up until now, North Korea hasn't had nuclear weapons. Now it does, and it seems far more frightening. But the United States has been here before. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, and it seemed very frightening, and it was very frightening, and it was way bigger. And the damage it could have done to the United States and the world was much bigger. And the United States stayed cool, and it got through the other side. Because the underlying logic of the containment policy is reasonably analogous, right? The logic of containment was bottle up the Soviet Union where it is, try not to let it expand any further than it goes, and the inherent tensions and incompatibilities of its own internal system will collapse in on itself, and something will change. All you have to do is wait. Now, it doesn't mean do nothing, it means contain, but of the potential set of outcomes, it seems like the one that has the, or the choices, it seems like the one that has the the least action in it. And in that sense, it feels like a capitulation. But I want to explain why I think that isn't the case. So in order to determine strategy, I agree here with the points that Colonel Maxwell was saying, we've got to understand what the strategic interests here are of the actors involved, the United States and Korea. And we have to recognize that their interests are configured, at least this would be my contention, in very different ways. Both states, unsurprisingly, right, all of you here are SIS students of some form or another, right, somehow linked to this, right, all states seek survival. So that's not an especially interesting observation to begin with. We know that states seek to survive. The question is, what is the meaning of survival for these states? And once we can understand that a little bit more, in a little bit more detail, I think we're in a better place to understand why the United States should pick the policy I'm proposing. What does the United States want? Well, we can identify at least 3 interests it has in this region. The most obvious one that it has is it wishes to increase its own security. North Korea developing nuclear weapons is inherently frightening. You know, when there was that accidental launch warning in Hawaii, we had friends who were there at the time, my wife and I, who were sending us texts afterwards saying we thought we were all going to die. It's not funny, it's a serious threat. And I take it seriously, and everyone should take it seriously. But it's just one way that the United States is being threatened. Its national security is being threatened very directly. However, there's other interests, national security interests, that are being met in that peninsula. Critically here, the United States meets 2 other interests in that peninsula with the current policies it has. One is the United States has got interests in the region in maintaining the alliances it has and in maintaining and increasing the influence it has with states in that region, especially vis-a-vis China. So it can't make any choices regarding South Korea and North Korea without also recognizing that these choices have implications for its other regional interests. Broader than that, the United States has global interests. It's really the only state in the system that has global interests. The United States is the leader of the international liberal order, for better or for worse, whether people are like it or not, and it is something that the United States should consider to be in its interest because it gives the United States an enormous amount of leverage for, all told, a reasonably small buy-in. What the United States has to do to have this amount of influence in the world is reasonably small, but one of the things that it has to do, of course, to do that is to reinforce the norms and logic and behaviors and processes that are consistent with that international order. So it's got these 3 interests, and my point here is that they're not easily separated from one another. Yes, we can see that the national security interest is the priority, but the other 2 are not separated from that, right? The only way we can explain why the United States has got a threat in Korea at all is to understand that the United States understands its national interest as being something that is over there as well as here. And not all countries do that. So it's a little bit different in that sense. What about North Korea? Well, I agree here with what Colonel Maxwell was saying. They want to maintain the regime, right? That is clear. The Kim family's first priority is to survive. And I put that here as number 1. Now, I have here in my notes 1.5, interest 1.5, closely linked to the first one, is keep the nukes. Because the nukes here are clearly going to be the best mechanism for this regime to maintain its survival against external threats. The United States has made it clear, especially recently, that any nuclear deal you sign with the United States may not be worth the paper it's printed on. And so this is problematic, right? The most likely diplomatic way out of this nuclear process was probably going to be something analogous to the Iran deal. The United States has currently shown that deals you sign with it around nuclear policy may not be worth the paper they're printed on. Any sensible realist in this room will now recognize, don't give up your nukes. Because all bets are off once they're gone. So we should imagine that they're going to be strongly committed to keeping these precisely because they're the best mechanism for keeping their regime intact. Secondly, they want to improve their position in the peninsula. You know, there's a bunch of arguments, I'm sure some of you are familiar with them, over the summer about a big part of what the summit was for the Kim regime was an opportunity to sort of go on a kind of sunshine tour around the region saying, look, we've got the nukes, now we're not so bad, maybe we can get some, economic credits, we can build up a bit of diplomatic capital in the region. They've got regional, they would like not to be such a pariah. And lastly, they would like to unify the peninsula. They would like, in a perfect world, to have a situation in which they can extend their power across South Korea and unify the peninsula under their terms. Now, my contention here is these interests, unlike the United States interests, are somewhat more hierarchically stacked. That is to say, security of regime is more important than nukes, is more important than regional favor, is more important than unifying the peninsula. And recognizing that that's probably the way, now that's the assumption that I'm happy to have people challenge, but that's the assumption I'm working from. If you accept that assumption, then it means that you have to recognize that the nukes will be the hardest thing to lever from them because it's the thing most close to their first priority, which is staying alive. So the United States, in some sense then, has to really recognize that it's going to be hard to get rid of these nuclear weapons. So what does this, and it also means, critically here, that in establishing and developing any policy, the United States can't just think about its own interests, it has to think about the interests of its strategic interlocutor. What will its opponent be most likely to give up on? What will its hard lines be? When will it snap and go into an aggressive state? When will it essentially stay passive and put up with whatever you're doing to it? So as a consequence here, the United States, now broadly speaking, I'm caricaturing this somewhat, it has three potential choices it can make. Right? The one that you sometimes hear floated is it can attack. It can attack and eliminate this threat once and for all. It can strike North Korea. It can do so probably with a range of sophisticated weaponry, airstrikes, special operations, all sorts of things going, and it has a reasonable chance, not a great chance, but a reasonable chance of toppling the regime in such a way that it doesn't launch a nuke back, and that also it can secure the nukes by the end of the process, which is a completely separate and also frightening dynamic here. But so that's one option. Now the problem with this is it's self-defeating. Because if the United States does that, and let's assume a perfect world in which the operation goes off without a hitch, it doesn't fire any nukes, it captures all the warheads, problem solved. Congratulations, the United States has met objective 1. It has now absolutely, utterly shattered objectives 2 and 3. Because if it started a war with North Korea, it's South Korea who would pay the toll. And all the United States allies in the region would see that. And would see that when the United States feels scared, it will burn your country to live. And so that would not make it look very good in the lines of the allies. In doing so, the only way to be able to launch one of these wars would have to be through extra legal provisions. There's no way the UN would sanction a war like this. There's no way that the international community would sanction a war like this. So it would burn up the diplomatic capital it has, much of which has already been spent in the international global order. It would probably lose its leadership position as a consequence of a preemptive strike like this. So it would lose a lot of the important leadership role it has globally and regionally with the benefit of feeling a bit safer when it goes to bed at night, which is not a bad thing, but those are, I contend, are the trade-offs. What's the other option? They could withdraw. Now, if it withdraws, it would again meet its number one objective, right? If the United States got out of the North Korean Peninsula, there's no reason, or the Korean Peninsula, there's no reason North Korea would point its weapons at it. So it could go home, it could go to bed at night, it could feel safe, it could be safe behind its massive moat of the Pacific and the Atlantic. It would know that if people strike at it, it could strike back, and things would go okay. The problem is, it will once again jeopardize its other two objectives. If the United States leaves the East Asian region, it will be creating a power vacuum in the area. That will be filled by China, that will be filled by a rearming Japan, that will be filled by most likely a rearming South Korea. And so you'd be trading one set of security problems, very immediate ones for the United States, for a whole set of security problems down the road. Now East Asia becomes militarized and becomes an active security region in the world, because the US umbrella has been an important block on that for the last 70 years. Lastly, of course, allies see it doing this, right? So it retreats, so all other alliances are now on notice, right? If you're a member of NATO, which is already a lot of NATO members are talking about, is there a thing that they should do, or should they break off and form their own militaries? They're going to feel that compulsion even more. So again, withdrawal might meet that first, very immediate, traditional, realist objective of getting safer, but it will jeopardize these more nebulous and still crucially important, I would contend, parts of US power, which is its leadership stake abroad. So that essentially leaves us only with the last option, which is containment. Now, containment does not mean do nothing. It means contain. And it means bottle up North Korea as much as you can. Right? It means stopping it from trying to have the initiative on those other two areas regarding unification and regarding its position in the region. Right? The United States, by acting like this, would not be able to meet its first objective as well as it would like. Right? So here this would be a little bit more in jeopardy. The United States wouldn't feel as secure as if it won a war or withdrew. So that would be a bit shakier, but it would gain a lot on the other two. It would maintain its regional position. If it behaved in a very sensible and restrained way in the area, it would build up its leadership again in the area, and it would build it up globally. It would buy goodwill, it would buy support, and it would also here critically create opportunities for other things to take place, right? Because it's a waiting game. You know, this would create the political space where maybe the United States could come to some sort of agreement with China with regards to North Korea. It can't do that if it starts firing. It could create perhaps the space where some sort of sunshine policy between South Korea and North Korea could slowly develop into something analogous to Ostpolitik in Germany in the 70s and the 80s. It creates space for other options. And it critically means that when those other options present itself, the United States would be seen as a legitimate, fair, sensible, and cool-headed stakeholder in those debates. Right? It would not be seen as reckless. It would be seen as somebody who has a right to participate in these things and it would be taken seriously. And so basically, it sounds like I'm saying choose nothing. I am saying choose something, but it just means choosing the thing that gives the least immediate control of the situation with the hope that in the future the United States will be better able to do something about it. Okay, that's my position. I look forward to questions.
So I'm gonna prod each of you a little bit on your remarks with a couple questions, and then really open it up to all the audience. So, Dr. Banks, let me start with you. So you came out pretty strongly in favor of containment as sort of the least bad option there is. And so two things that flow from that. Because one thing, at one point you said, containment means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And you said that what your version of containment is not exactly the status quo. There's a lot more we could be doing. So one is, what are the measures the United States could or should be taking that it's currently not to pursue a policy of containment? I don't know if it's missile defense and other aspects and sanctions, or the Trump administration has discussed maximum pressure, whatever that means. And so one is the list of measures. And two, you mentioned at some point that, and this was part of the strategy for during the Soviet Union, is that you contain in order to initiate internal regime collapse, which isn't regime change in the way that when the United States in these days, when we talk about regime change, we think of an Iraq war style approach. But is your version of containment analogous to the one you laid out, the Soviet Union, which is the United States should be increasing the pressure and trying to cordon off or limit North Korean expansion such that the regime crumbles internally upon itself?
So thank you for the question. So yes, I mean basically the version I'm thinking of here is the one where the regime crumbles in on itself. But I want to make a few caveats, which is firstly, U.S. containment policy during the Cold War. It's a broad strategy that had a lot of nuance, right? Containment meant something very different to, say, President Truman or President Carter than it did to President Reagan. They all saw it somewhat differently, but there was a core central logic, which was bottle this regime up as much as possible. Now, so it doesn't mean there couldn't be variation in the way you want to address those policies, or how you want to execute those policies rather, but it just means that that's the overall strategic goal. Now, the important point about this is it doesn't mean topple the regime intentionally. It also doesn't mean, as I said, get rid of the nukes. Right? This would begin from the position of the United States accepts that the nuclear weapons are there and has to live with that new reality. But what it does mean is that it would create this space where it could engage in other policies. It could signal, for example, to the Korean regime that it's not going to try to actively topple it, while at the same time saying, we're waiting for you to expire on your own time. This would be a useful signal, I think, to send to China, which is we're not trying to destroy your client. We are just not going to put up with your client. It's got nuclear weapons, so what? That doesn't change anything else. That would be the United States' essential position by containment. Nothing else changes and nothing else is up for negotiation. And so, yes, it could still move to have a strong defensive forces put in Korea. I don't think it needs to move nuclear weapons into the Korean Peninsula. I think the trip line that is US forces on the DMZ is sufficiently credible to convince North Korea that if they cross that line, the United States will probably go all in. I can't really see a scenario in which you attack 30,000 US troops and the United States doesn't go to war. And I'm sure North Korea can't also see that scenario, so I don't think it has to go to that kind of level of escalation. But I guess my point is that if it sounds like I'm being vague here, I think that's part of my point. This is a policy where there's a general aim, which is okay, which is to just try to bottle it up and wait for things to develop, without forcing you to kind of commit to something that is essentially irreversible. A policy towards war is irreversible. Once the war starts, you are now at war. And it's also extremely hard to control. Herman von Moltke famously said, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So the minute the United States goes to war with Korea, if that ever happens, whatever happens next is not what we thought was going to happen next. It might be close to it, but it won't be what we thought would happen next. Similarly, withdrawal, that's irrevocable, right? The United States withdraws, it withdraws. It can come back later, but the damage will be done. I think here this is a place where the United States can try different measures, but send a signal clearly to North Korea that your nukes don't mean anything with regards to anything else regarding the strategic situation, signal that to its allies, signal that to China, and then work at the margins. Make it clear that it's not going to go beyond that itself, but it's not going to accept any line over that on its side. And I think that would still create plenty of space to engage in the kinds of things that went on in the Cold War, Radio Free Europe, trying to help local actors or local sort of insurgent groups, not military insurgents, but like political insurgents. You can still do all of that stuff without the danger of escalating it into a real war. That was my contention.
Colonel Maxwell, so one of the words that I thought was shockingly absent actually from both your opening remarks, although you just said it twice in your answers to my question, was the word China. And you talked about the desired outcome of U.S. policy for North Korea, the Korean Peninsula, should be peaceful unification or United Republic of Korea that is somewhat liberal but somewhat stable. One of the big gorillas, I guess, in the situation is China. Would China allow that? But on the other side, China doesn't want North Korea to collapse either. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how does the role of China, which seems to be a far greater priority in American foreign policy generally, what role does China play in your sort of desired strategy here, and does that create a trade-off with other issues we may have with China that we may have to compromise on?
That's a great question. You might be familiar with China's 3 no's. No war, no instability and collapse, and no nukes. So they're a pretty good baseball team. They've batted 600. And so that's a rough paraphrase of how China looks at North Korea. And of course, there's no love lost between North Korea and China. I think it's a mistake for us to say that we can influence China to solve our security problem. They're not going to do that. I think in the last year, we saw China support sanctions more, not to force North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, but really to placate us, because I think they really feared that we might take military action. And I agree with David. Military action, having studied it, having looked at the casualty figures, having looked at the devastation, we do not want to initiate a war on the Korean Peninsula. It is not going to be pretty. And it'll be on a scale of devastation that we haven't seen really since the terminating or the suspension of hostilities of the Korean War. Now, what does China want? I think that we've been working on the plans for collapse. 1997, the first time we went to China, and we told them we were concerned with North Korean collapse, and we laid out our contingency plans for them in broad terms, and they said thank you very much, and no reciprocity. Over the years, we continue to engage. In fact, we attended another track 2 in October with a Chinese delegation, South Korean delegation, and a U.S. delegation, and looking at these problems. What I think China wants on the Korean Peninsula, and I think that they will accept a unified Korea, but they want 2 things. One is they want continued access to the resources that they have, that they've taken out 50 and 100-year leases for. There are lots of minerals, lots of resources in North Korea. In fact, in 1989, the UN Tumen River Area Development Program said there are some of the largest untapped resources in North Korea, rare earth metals and the like, that nobody can get access to because of the political situation. But China is taking out 50 and 100-year leases. And they're going to demand in a unified Korea, because both countries' constitutions claim sovereignty over the entire peninsula and over all the people. So if there's a unified Korea, they're going to say, we've made these agreements, we want them to remain intact, and we want access to our resources. But the second point that they want, the second objective, is U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula. This is really, they will accept a unified Korea if there are no U.S. forces. So what I tell my Korean counterparts, South Korean counterparts, is they're the ones that really have the advantage here. For a long time, in all of our war planning, Korea has always said, and we've always made the assumption that we're going to be able to keep China out of Korea diplomatically. And the military loves to make that assumption. And we say that we make our plans so we don't go near the North Korean-Chinese border, so as not to provoke them, which is, again, as David said, von Moltke's right, the second and third order effects of military operations are not what you think they're going to be. So we've always made these assumptions we could keep them out. We have to assume China will intervene. And in the writings that I do, China will intervene to protect their interests, to protect their border, to protect and secure nuclear weapons, which the majority of them are in close proximity to China, not to the DMZ. So China has access to them. But in the end, what they're going to do is put forces on the peninsula and then tell a unified Korea that we think all foreign forces should withdraw. And what I tell my South Korean friends is you should tell the Chinese that the future of the ROK-US alliance and the status of the U.S. forces is going to be conditions-based. It's going to be based on the security conditions. And it is a decision between the Republic of Korea and the U.S. or a united Republic of Korea and the U.S. and how the Mutual Defense Treaty evolves in a unified situation. But the presence of U.S. forces is a mutual decision between those 2 governments, not the Chinese, not the Russians, not the United Nations. But they should tell the Chinese that if the security situation is such, maybe U.S. forces are not warranted on the peninsula. There are people here in D.C. who say we should tell the Chinese right now if there's unification, we'll withdraw. I think that's a mistake to do that. I think we should always keep our options open. And I think the South Koreans can use that, a conditions-based scenario there, to influence China to hold out, the possibility that we will leave the peninsula. And of course, the fact is that if there's a unified Korea, the people who demand that U.S. forces leave, maybe many of you in this room. It may be the United States that says we have no more need for U.S. forces there, and so we would come home. And that's a very real possibility. But China is going to act. China is going to seek to get U.S. forces off the peninsula and to maintain economic and political influence over the Korean Peninsula.
Dr. Banks, you mentioned two things in your remarks that lead to this question. So one, obviously, like you said, this analogy to sort of the Cold War in the Soviet Union, where we had containment, but we also engaged with them. We actually signed a series of arms limitation agreements with the Soviets, some of which they kept better than others, but we did sign them. They were a significant part of our strategy. So that was one aspect. And the other you mentioned is that the United States, under the Trump administration, withdrew from an agreement it had reached with Iran and other international partners. So my question would be is, would you support a Iran deal style arms limitation agreement between the United States and North Korea? If so, what would it have to include for you to support? And are you concerned that North Korea itself has not exactly abided by past agreements? It signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and then withdrew. It signed a number of agreements, first with the Clinton administration, that it violated over time. So would you support such a deal under this containment policy, and what are your concerns of what might that look like?
Thanks for the question. So I think in principle, and far be it for me to get into the technical details, not least of all because I wouldn't know them all, but in principle I'd support an agreement like that, and let me explain why I agree with it in principle, and then we can talk about the specifics, which is that the success of the Iran deal, in so much as it existed and when it was working, is that it had buy-in from all the major powers in the system. That was I think the key to its success, right? It wasn't just the United States and Iran striking a deal. It was finding a common denominator that all major powers, or the more important major powers, could agree with about how an Iranian denuclearization program would occur, and it got that mutual buy-in, right? So I think anything the United States, any kind of agreement that the United States would sign with North Korea would be made much more powerful by bringing in, for example, Chinese consent, and bringing in Russia, I guess to a lesser extent, but certainly China, and bringing in other members of the international community, bringing in Japan, bringing in other regional stakeholders who have the kind of influence to sort of feel like they should be at the table. Because then it makes the United States not have to be the only one who has to pull the leash if something goes wrong, right? It means that North Korea would have to worry about how this looks like to its Chinese patron, or how this looks like to some other state in the area. And so that gives it, makes it not a US deal. I mean, we always talk about the US-Iran deal there like it was a US-Iran deal, but it wasn't a US-Iran deal. It was a multi-state deal. That's what I think made it difficult. It's what made the solution so narrow, right? The only thing they could get on the docket was nukes and not other stuff, because nobody else wanted to talk about the other stuff, so why would they negotiate around it? But I think that would work in principle. Now I do accept the issue, which is that North Korea has proven itself to be completely untrustworthy when it comes to these kind of deals. And so I think that would be an issue about how you negotiate exactly how a deal would operate, which would probably require North Korea to have to front load a lot of its good behavior on the grounds that it doesn't. And so it would be required, probably unlike the Iran deal, to do more up front before it got something on the back end, which you might not agree with. But that's more an issue of technicality than it is kind of the principle of the deal. So in principle, I think that could be a way out. And so I don't know if that would be the way out. I think my overall point always about this containment thing is that it gives space to see these opportunities when they arise, see if they work, see if they don't, save your powder for another day.
Colonel Maxwell, so you mentioned, I don't want to misquote you, so you can correct me if it's the exact word, but you mentioned that basically the Trump administration has gotten hoodwinked or taken for a ride, or I don't know what the exact word you want to use, by the Kim regime in terms of the diplomacy that's gone on so far. So let me pose a little bit of a counter to you as opposed to where we were a year ago. So we were sort of in somewhat of a freeze for freeze situation, right? Whereas after 8 months or 9 months of escalating North Korean ICBM tests to demonstrate, to show their teeth a little bit, it's been almost a year, or 10 months or something like that, since they've done so, which some people will read as a sign or a symbol of showing a little bit of faith or patience in negotiations. And similarly, the United States, as you mentioned, has suspended its military exercises with South Korea as well. There seems to be a little bit of freeze for freeze. We haven't frozen or taken off any sanctions that we've put on North Korea. We've actually continued to sanction North Korean entities. We've managed to push through the UN, which most people would probably think unthinkable under this administration, push through the UN, successive unanimous UN Security Council resolutions on these issues. So is it, how bad, I mean, I don't know, you can correct me on the word you used, but is it really all that bad at this moment compared to where we were a year ago?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we're obviously in a better place. You know, it's better to jaw than war, right? And as they say. So, you know, first, a way to look at a year ago the nuclear test, November the last missile test. Another way to look at that, not that they're exercising good faith, is that they've completed the development of their programs and they no longer need to test. And in fact, Kim Jong-nam's words on Sunday basically said that in his speech, that we've attained our military capabilities. And of course, when Kim Jong-un in his New Year's speech, when he embarked on what we're going through now as the charm offensive, as some of us call it, he said that they're ready for mass production of missiles and their capabilities. So, not testing, may mean that they've developed the capabilities to a certain extent. Now, hoodwinked, my real point is that President Moon and President Trump adopted Kim Jong-un's narrative at Panmunjom. That's really what they've done, and we are not precise with our words, and so we say denuclearization. CVID used to be complete, irreversible, verifiable, or complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear program, not denuclearization. And but as I said, North Korea looks at denuclearization of the entire peninsula, and that has put us in a difficult negotiating position. And because North Korea also looks at the Panmunjom and Singapore documents as contracts, and so the North has not really reciprocated in good faith. President Trump gave a major concession by suspending the exercise. The regime has demanded this as a demonstration of the end of the hostile policy to suspend or cancel exercises. He did that unilaterally on June 12th. It's the last all-nighter I pulled, staying up all night to watch that in Singapore, because the time difference here. And I really woke up when he said he wants to pull U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula. And then he called the exercises war games that are provocative and too expensive. All of those words are music to Kim Jong-un's ears. So what's happened after the summit? They've returned 55 remains. Two reports today, two may be identified today, and that they're close to identifying those. They may have as many as 200 remains that are ready to be returned. They only returned 55. What country, would not return, the remains of soldiers? I would submit that that's not a very responsible, international actor by holding those 145 other remains as bargaining chips. They've dismantled the Sohae liquid-fueled satellite launch facility, and which, of course, it's liquid-fueled, which makes it very easy for us to determine a launch. It is not a significant military threat. And, of course, they've destroyed, they've showed us the destruction of the two entrances to the nuclear test tunnels. And, some analysts think that those tunnels were already destroyed by the 6 previous nuclear tests. So those are the 3 major things that North Korea has done to demonstrate sincerity. And none of that is any way a substantive move towards dismantlement of its nuclear program. So they have not operated in good faith. That said, this is the month of Korean diplomacy. I mean, we are really at an inflection point. President Moon is going to go to Pyongyang on September 18th. We're going to have the UN General Assembly. South Korea will speak on the 25th. North Korea will speak on the 29th. And coming out of this, and I think you're exactly right, we're seeing a freeze for freeze, which was a Chinese proposal over a year ago. We may also see a declaration for declaration. And that's a declaration of the end of the Korean Civil War and a declaration of North Korea's nuclear weapons and materials. And that, and when you really think about it, and this is where we're really between a rock and a hard place, ROK or ROCK. President Moon and Kim Jong-un want to declare an end to the Korean War. They want to establish peace. And so, who are we to stand in the way of that? I mean, think about the optics of that to say, no, we want you to remain at war. And the war is technically between North and South. North was the aggressor. UN Security Council resolution identified them as the aggressor, called on member states to come to the aid of South Korea. We don't have standing for a peace treaty because we intervened under the UN flag, but that's a separate story. So they may make this declaration, and what I think that they're doing, Kim Jong-un's letter to President Trump said that I want to denuclearize by the end of your first term. It's telling President Trump that Kim Jong-un thinks he's going to have a second term. And that's very good. And what they're doing is, I think, they are setting the conditions for President Trump to have a big win. And the big win is that there will be peace on the Korean Peninsula. And that after the September 18th summit, they're going to come to President Trump and say, look, freeze for freeze, declaration for declaration, and you, President Trump, will have done something that no president since President Truman was able to do, and that's bring peace to the Korean Peninsula. Now, will there really be peace? Just one quick point. 1.2 million men, 70% of them are between the DMZ and Pyongyang, 14,000 artillery pieces. As I've told my Korean counterparts, the military attaches and political officers at the embassy, if President Moon is not demanding confidence-building measures to establish a mechanism so that North Korea does not have the offensive capability to attack the South, they're putting South Korea at great risk. And what I've argued is that they need to demand a pullback of the artillery, at least 20 kilometers and better 40 kilometers, because that means that North Korea will not be able to attack without notice. Right now they can attack without notice, and they will devastate Seoul and the forward areas. So if there's going to be a declaration of the peace regime, there has got to be a conventional arms control regime established to be able to ensure the protection of the South. And President Moon seems to want peace at any cost. And as I said, that can be quite expensive. And that's one of the things I really worry about.
Great, thank you. All right, so let's open it up to questions. So I think, I can't quite see, but Kevin or somebody in the back has a microphone. So I'll call on questions from up here. If you could just stand up, wait for the mic, say your name, say your year, and maybe your program if you want, and then obviously make sure your question ends with a question mark. So if I see hands up, I can kind of call from here, right here in the red shirt in the aisle, please.
Hi, I'm Mason. I'm a freshman political science major. Both of you noted and seem to agree that North Korea's #1 priority is to maintain its own survival. I know that there are a couple other North Korea scholars who seem to think that one of North Korea's top priorities is to be recognized and legitimized as a state or a legitimate country on the international stage. Do you believe that that's true, and if it's one of North Korea's top priorities, and if not, why not?
Yes, I think they do want that, but I don't think that's a top priority. I think regime survival is. They do, and of course, to echo what David was saying about negotiations, I think the North would really like to have strategic arms limitation talks or reduction talks with the United States, because that would put them on an equal footing with us. And I think one of the things they really want is, with nuclear weapons, is to be recognized as a nuclear power, and at least on par with a Pakistan-India type situation there. But a direct negotiation for limitation talks would really enhance their legitimacy. But both Gabe and David have said, and I agree with, nuclear weapons are key to their survival. And so if they talk about reduction, that's okay, or limitation and some reduction. But the key is they want to keep them for their survival, and I think that's what we have to keep in mind. Let me just add to what David was saying about deterrence and containment, which I believe in cope, contain, and manage. Is the three, contain is the middle. But when Wang Zhongyap defected in 1997, he was the father of Juche ideology, the highest ranking defector. The first thing we asked him, the Americans asked him, was, you spent all this money in your military, why haven't you attacked the South, reinitiated hostilities to achieve your objectives. And he looked at us and said, oh, American nuclear weapons. We can't win a war with the United States, and the United States will use nuclear weapons. And what that says is two things. Declaratory policy works. And the second is it explains why Kim Il-sung started pursuing nuclear weapons in the 1950s. Sent 250 students to Moscow to get PhDs in technical disciplines in 1957. And so they've been pursuing nuclear weapons for all of that time. And the last thing is they believe that the United States will not initiate a war against a country that has nuclear weapons. So that's their deterrent perspective there as well. So I think we have to keep that in mind.
Just something to add, or?
No, that's fine.
All right. Next question, right up here, the white shirt in the front.
Hi, I'm Wallace, I'm a freshman, I'm an SIS, and you both have talked a lot about policy, about what we should do now, but something that I've always been curious about is unification, whether that can even be done in a peaceful manner, because what we're talking about is millions of people that have been brainwashed for years and years and years, and whether that's even possible, whether that's economically sound for South Korea, because they'll take on all the financial burdens of North Korea, and what should the policy look like for reintegration?
I can't answer what the policy should look like for reintegration. I do think that the one analogously speaking, excuse me, the one that we often look to is East Germany and West Germany, but it really is a bad analog. It's been 70 odd years now since these two communities were really in touch with one another, and furthermore, unlike East Germany and West Germany, they don't have any real links. I mean, East Germany, whole parts of East Germany were getting West German television the whole time that the Cold War was going. It wasn't impossible to visit relatives or meet relatives. You could just meet them. You just had to meet them on the other side of the Iron Curtain. What you couldn't do is you couldn't get out yourself and get into the West, but it wasn't hard to have your relatives come and meet you in Hungary or something. So the level of division is far greater. And like you say, it's not just economic, which is enormously. I mean, the two economies are completely separate now, and also the northern economy is obviously a completely diminished command economy, so it would have an extremely hard time integrating into the southern economy in any meaningful way, except for maybe something like what Colonel Maxwell mentioned, things like it's got these big mineral deposits, so maybe you could just drop a few massive mines and try to get the engine kick-started that way. But also there's a huge social and cultural divide at this stage. I mean, they are really, in some senses, two different countries, and so I think that it's not for the United States to decide this. I agree with that. It's for the Koreans to decide this amongst themselves. But I think the idea that it would be an easy swallow is not true. I think it would be a very difficult challenge. And even Germany today is still struggling with the challenge of reunification. It's causing huge problems inside its internal domestic politics. And so I think it wouldn't be easy, but I think whatever policy would be, it would probably cause huge turmoil.
Yeah, I've got to really address this. This is a really important question, and there's so much to cover on this. I think there are more PhDs in South Korea or have written dissertations on East and West German unification than probably any other subject. They study the heck out of that. But David's right. The difference is it is not a good analog, although there are lessons to be learned, and so it is worth studying. Brainwashing, you use that term. Of course, they've been indoctrinated. Kim Kwang-jin is a fairly high-ranking escapee. His son came here, couldn't speak English, graduated from Fairfax County High School, was valedictorian in 2011. But he escaped. He was a money launderer for Kim Jong-il. Was called back, and he had his wife and son, and so they defected. And I talked to him about this, about brainwashing. One, he says that all North Koreans are liars, and which is a pretty harsh statement. And the way he explains it is that they have to lie to the regime, lie to each other, and lie to themselves. And they're not the liar in the pejorative sense that we, that we use that. But they're getting a massive amount of information into North Korea. In fact, tomorrow I'm going to do Washington Talk, which is a Voice of America show that is broadcast to the elite in Pyongyang. And I've done 4 of the shows with VOA, and I'm going to do it tomorrow morning. And so we are transmitting a lot of information, but Koreans in the South are sending a lot, DVDs, thumb drives. They love dramas from South Korea. You know, there's so much that's going in. Well, Kim Kwang-jin says that, you know, when they're faced with this 60, 70 years of indoctrination their whole lives, and the information from the outside world that they know is true, they know that South Korea has a much greater standard of living. He says, he describes it as a psychological paralysis. Because in the end, you know, it's Maslow's hierarchy. I mean, they've got to survive. And so, I will give you a quick anecdote on a way to do this. They are different countries, very different countries, but they come from the same people. And of course, you know, Korea never had a history of democracy, free markets, and you know, until after the war, South Korea developed. So I was talking with a Korean admiral, and he said, you know, there's 2 miracles in Korea. And of course, I know the miracle on the Han. The miracle on the Han, South Korea rose from the ashes of the Korean War, developed economically, politically, culturally. You know, it's really a middle power, and Korean wave, and you know, it's got a global influence, and certainly the 8th to 11th largest economy in the world. And I said, so what's the other miracle? He said, the miracle is the miracle on the Taedong, and the Taedong is the river that runs through Pyongyang, like the Han River runs through Seoul. And I said, well, what's the miracle about that? And he said, well, the miracle is, you know, after 65 years, that the people in North Korea still survive. And his point was, and the way he described this, is that if given the opportunity, Koreans will thrive. You know, South Koreans developed this entrepreneurial spirit, I mean, very innovative, and they took to democracy with no past history of that. Of course, we've obviously assisted in that and influenced that, but the Koreans in the North, you know, survived. And, you know, both Koreas survived, you know, the hardships of the Korean War. And so his point is that if given the same opportunities in the North, that Koreans in the North will thrive as well. And in fact, you know, it is a command economy that's failed, but the Center for Strategic International Studies, was it Beyond Parallel? They do a lot of studies on unification. They've counted almost 500 authorized markets in Korea. There's, you know, after the arduous march of 1994 to 1996, maybe as many as 3,000 people died. You know, families had to survive, and you know, black markets started popping up, and the regime couldn't stop them because the public distribution system had failed in most places. And that has given rise to a black market economy, which is really, you know, at its base, you know, a form of capitalism. And so that's growing inside North Korea. And that is one of the things that can. What the real problem is a forced absorption, trying to raise the standard of living to equal South Korea. That's one of the things South Korea fears the most. When people say, do you want unification? Oh, my heart, I want it. Do you want to pay for it? Hell no. You know, I mean, that's kind of the problem that you have in South Korea. But in the end, if North Korea collapses, there is no longer, you know, it is Korea. And paragraph 60 of the armistice said that within 90 days, all the political parties are supposed to come together and solve the Korea question. And the Korea question is the unnatural division of the peninsula. And so if North Korea no longer exists, you know, 25 million people in the north, you know, have to go somewhere or have to determine what they're going to be for the future. And I think unification is really the only way. The issue, and David really gets to this, it is a complex problem, and South Korea really has to do this. Park Geun-hye, you know, one of the Dresden Initiative, you know, now President Moon has really backed off that. He wants peace, 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 which is not a bad thing, and then talk about a confederation process. And if that goes through with an existing Kim family regime and Kim Jong-un, that puts South Korea in a very dangerous position to not end up with a united Republic of Korea.
Great. All right, two right up here. Why don't we take these two together right next to each other?
Hi, my name is Blake. I'm an SIS student, sophomore here. I have two questions that are somewhat related. First, a lot of Chinese cooperation in regards to sanctions on the peninsula, and Xi Jinping's maybe philosophy of Chinese regional hegemony and security kind of communicates that North Korea is becoming more and more of a liability. If the regime were to collapse on its own, or it just became too much of a hassle, maybe what are the chances that China intervenes and occupies North Korea itself? You know, kind of gets us back at square one of, well, this is just now an extension of the communist regime in Beijing. What's the likelihood? What are the implications? Second, just humor us a little, because it's been allegedly reported that Senator Graham has sat in on some national security conversations and suggested, oh so brilliantly, that we should assassinate Kim Jong-un and replace him with a general that is friendly to us. So if you could give some serious discussion on the first question and maybe humor me on the second.
Right here. Thank you.
My name is Jonah. I'm a freshman in the history department. Related to the question about what unification under South Korea would look like, what makes the Kim family think that South Korea would ever submit to a united Korea under the North, and how would this not imperil their first imperative, which is to survive this regime?
Okay, so 3 questions, which is, would the Chinese intervene militarily, and what does that look like? Should the United States assassinate Kim Jong-un, what would that look like? And given what we know about South Korea, which is a hell of a lot more than North Korea, why does the North think that it could unify under its command and continue to maintain its regime? So who wants to tackle which you want to
Take your staff first.
I'll go quick. I'll go quickly through them. On the first one, which is would China want to invade, without being a regional specialist, I would think that, just broadly speaking, it's not. I don't think they'd have an interest in taking over the territory. The Chinese mechanism for expansion and power is not based on territorial occupation. It would like Taiwan back for historical reasons, but it's not in general trying to build some sort of autarkic empire in Asia. So it has no real incentive to try to occupy land for the sake of occupying it. So I'd imagine that even if they did do that, to intervene, which I think was primarily done to lock down nuclear weapons before they disappeared off the black market, they would probably do so in a way that would then try to extricate themselves from the situation. That would be my guess, without knowing about it, because they're not afraid to be aggressive, but I don't think they're trying to establish economic hegemony as much as anything. I think on the second issue, I think it gets to the point of risk. The idea that you can assassinate a leader of a government, A, and get away with it. That is, say, that would succeed as a mission. But B, that when you succeed in that mission, that what happens next is the thing that you want to happen. It's just fraught with risk. And the payoff is great if it works, and the disaster is enormous if it doesn't. One of my favorite quotes, Bismarck, is preemptive war, suicide out of fear of death. This is really lighting a fire under a stick of dynamite, hoping that you'll get away with it. So it's just not necessary. I also don't think it solves problems. It assumes that the problem here can be laid at the foot of one person, which is it's a regime. It's not an individual. It's a regime. There's a whole bunch of generals who will take his place, who would run the government, still in the interest of the military clique. I think on the last point, which is how do they think it would work, I have no idea how they think it would work. I would imagine that the reason they think it would work the way I would think it would work is because I think for the Kim regime, military power, physical power is the only power that matters. So I would imagine in their head, the way they would govern would be through military occupation, because that's essentially how they govern themselves. But I don't know what they would, if they really have the strategic horizons to think about how they would take into the world.
tackle these 3 questions?
Absolutely. All right. So the first one, Chinese intervention. My experience with the Chinese doing track 2 is exactly right. They don't want the Pottery Barn rule. You break it, you buy it. And so in some of the exercises that we've done, when the Chinese intervened in an exercise, we said, well, you're responsible for feeding the people, administering, ensuring security, and we don't want to do that. We want to get nuclear weapons. And so one of the things we've talked to the Chinese about is you need to think about functional intervention. Go in to perform a specific function and then leave. And there's some, the people we're dealing with are former diplomats, former military personnel, not speaking for the government, but these are the kind of things. But I agree with they don't want to occupy North Korea. They don't want that burden, and it will be a terrible burden. And the North Korean people and the Chinese people don't like each other. There's a lot of animosity between them. So that's one thing. Assassination, I think it's that Lindsey Graham wanted the Chinese to assassinate him.
All right.
Which, think about this, Kim Jong-nam, who was under the protection of China when he went to Malaysia, was assassinated. One of the analyses is that China had ideas about installing him as the successor to Kim Jong-un. And some people assess that that's why Kim Jong-un had his half-brother assassinated. Now, assassination scenarios. Sung Min Cho, a South Korean PhD student, just got his PhD at Georgetown, wrote an article in the International Journal of Korean Studies You can go online there. About 3 years ago, I used to edit it, so I'm very familiar with this article. He did the analyses on assassination of Kim Jong-un and what the scenarios. And he studied assassinations around the world. And he came to this very controversial conclusion. It was very controversial to the South Koreans when he presented it at this conference, is that the only way Kim Jong-un is likely to be assassinated will almost parallel the way Park Chung-hee was assassinated in 1979. Somebody close to him with access, acting alone. And which really goes to the third point about how North Korea views the South and unifying. First is subversion. And of course, the Chief of Staff, President Moon's Chief of Staff, has pledged allegiance to Juche ideology, never renounced it, spent 3 years in jail for violating the national security laws. And so there is penetration of the South Korean government, by North Korean sympathizers. And, Im Sung-jak is one of them. And so they believe that they can subvert the society. The second point is that North Korea has developed the most effective means of political and social control that's probably ever existed in modern history. The ability to control 25 million people. And so, like David says, they will use their military and their security apparatus to really control the Korean people in the South. There will not be a change in the North and a liberalization if they unify with the South. North's intent is, to enslave the other 50 million people that live in the South. That's their intent. Now, whether that would happen or not, I think that we would find the 50 million people in the South resisting that. But, the North believes that they can subvert the political system and come to an agreement through a confederation that they can assume control of the South. That's really their intent. I don't believe that'll happen, but I think that's the way they think.
Great. All right, one more round of questions, and then we'll get to closing statements. So let's do the three in the back, sort of there. So I see 3 hands up, so it doesn't matter the order, but let's do those 3 all together.
Hi, my name is Doug Willick. I'm a freshman in SPA, and my question is: so you both mentioned how there's large-scale human rights violations in North Korea, how there's thousands of people in camps. So to both of you, what do you think, or is there anything the U.S. can or should do differently in order to lessen these human rights violations? And if you think there isn't, how long do you think these violations will occur at this scale?
And then I think there's two next, and 2 in front, basically.
Hi, my name is Lee Block. I'm a junior in SIS, also studying Russian. I'm curious, specifically you, Colonel Maxwell, if you could speak of what the North Korean command and control structure looks like, as well as their strategic and operational doctrine, and how that might impact a future war.
Okay, great. And then in the blue t-shirt right up here.
Hi, my name's Chris. I'm a senior in SIS, and my question was if you could just go over briefly what does success look like to you on the Korean Peninsula. I think something that a lot of policy analysts lose track of is how long the conflict's been going on and whether their end game is denuclearization or the dismantlement of North Korea itself, or simply just everyone going home at the end of the day.
So that's actually perfect, because that was actually going to be my question to your closing statement. So why don't we do, to both of you, one is, what can or should the United States do about the widespread, large-scale, massive, human rights violations sounds pedantic almost to describe it. What can and should the United States do about that, and if it does or doesn't, how long might go on? Which both of you, and specifically Colonel Maxwell, what does North Korea command and control look like? And then we'll do closing statements on what is success.
Not the closing statement.
Not the closing statement. Let's do those first 2.
So obviously I'll completely dodge the second question. I'm not remotely qualified to answer the question about command and control structures in North Korea. But on the first question about the human rights violations, I think this is the tragedy of the politics that goes on at this level. We see similar things in places like Darfur 10 years ago. We see it in Syria right now. The United States does not have the ability here to solve this problem. This is something that's taking place inside a client of another major power. And I think that it would be obviously in our moral interest for the world to solve this problem, but the reality is that the United States went to war against North Korea to solve human rights problems. It would drag China into a war to protect it. And so now you're trading one problem for a far larger problem. And I don't just mean problem strategically, I mean morally, right? Because now you've got a shooting war going on between the United States and China and Korea and God knows who else. And so I think here, once the United States establishes that this is not in its immediate interest, because the United States can't solve the world's problems. And what it has to be responsible to here is its client, which is South Korea. And so here, the United States, that's the alliance it has, that's the people it needs to protect and still maintain its standing in the region. What it could do is it could appeal to China to try to address this issue. But the route into solving this problem, short of a full-scale intervention of some kind, wherever direction this is coming from, is through the Chinese side. I don't really see the United States having any leverage here, and I can't see a way that it could do anything short of full-scale military intervention, which just creates far greater human rights catastrophe in that part of the world than it solves. So it's I don't like this, and I don't like saying this, but that's the reality of the trade-offs, I feel like.
Yes, I have to agree with David. We are not going to go to war over human rights. However, as I mentioned, the United Nations Commission of Inquiry 2014, recommended, and accused the North of crimes against humanity, recommended referral to the International Criminal Court. Not something we're going to do in our current views of the International Criminal Court, which actually complicates some of the work I do with the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, because we can no longer make that recommendation. But what needs to happen, in talking to those Koreans who've escaped from political prison camps, they know that we can't go to war to save them. But what they really want is continued pressure. They don't want to be ignored. And this is very important. After the Commission of Inquiry came out, North Korea actually made some human rights changes. One of the many allegations was that they denied they had any disabled people in North Korea. And there are no provisions for taking care of disabled people. Well, since 2014, they've admitted they have disabled people, and they've changed their laws. Now, it's really just a facade, but they have written into their laws that they have rights, the disabled have rights. And so that is one indication, not that it's any kind of a significant improvement, but it is an indication that they respond to the external pressure on human rights, because it is an attack on their legitimacy. But most importantly, the focus on human rights gives people hope, and it will be very important during unification, and especially not just the United States, but South Korea. And this is problematic because the budget that South Korea is proposing for next year is going to reduce the budget for helping escapees from the North, refugees from the North, and increase the budget for economic development in the North. And that is problematic because that is not caring for the refugees that come from the North. But the people in the camps, they want to know that they are not forgotten. And so that's why it's important to do that. But nobody should be under any illusion that we can go to war to rescue them. Although I talk to many human rights people say to me, why can't we just parachute in there and save them? And of course, one of the things that many human rights people are very concerned about are the orders that we have heard that if there is a war, that the guards in those camps are to immediately kill all the prisoners, to hide the evidence. And this is why we need to focus on this, and this is why we need to tell those guards, if you take those actions, that you're not going to survive either. Or more importantly, you're going to be brought up on charges and the like there. So we have to focus on this. That's important. Command and control in Korea, 3 chains of control. We talk in the U.S. military about command and control. In North Korea, it's control and command. You have a traditional chain of command, generals down to private. Then you have, like any communist country, a political chain of command with your political commissars. But in North Korea, you have a third, and that's the security chain of command. At every level, you have a traditional commander, a political commissar, and a security officer. And so you have the watchers watching the watchers. So that is how the North Korean system works. And of course, it is really complex because all 3 commanders have to agree. And of course, the political commander often has seniority and can overrule the tactical commander. One of the problems is that Kim Jong-un has no professional military commanders inside his inner circle anymore. They're all political appointees, and which is problematic for understanding how war is conducted. Now, how they conduct war, we like to say that North Korea is an artillery army supported by a scheme of maneuver. They're going to attack the south with massive artillery. to create gaps in the front lines for their infantry and their mechanized and armored forces to penetrate. Their plan in a nutshell is that they're going to attack across the DMZ, not into Seoul, but to bypass Seoul to the east. They've got to rapidly penetrate the 5 South Korean defensive belts, get to the Han River crossings, cross the Han River, and then get to Busan before the United States can reinforce. That's their campaign plan in a nutshell. They've got to do that. And of course, now with nuclear weapons, we might see them used on the 7 UN bases in Japan, as well as on the port at Busan, again, to prevent the US ability to reinforce the peninsula. So that's a sad note there.
I don't know if it's as sad as talking about what does success look like, but we could try that. So to this gentleman's question, that was the question I was going to ask you to close with, which is you both defined the objectives of U.S. policy to be a little bit different, but you both acknowledge, obviously, the very difficult circumstances and factors in doing it. I think you probably both acknowledge that the likelihood of success is low, however one defines it. But so what does success look like? And frankly, if we were to reconvene here in 3 years or 5 years, do you expect the situation to have changed? And do you expect the situation to have changed for the better or for the worse? So maybe just a couple minutes on that. And since Colonel Maxwell, you started, I'll give Professor Banks the last word.
Okay. Well, first success is no war on the Korean Peninsula. Okay, I think that to me is number one. And so we prevent war. That is. But ultimate success has to be unification in my mind. And so we've got to get to a point where there is a unified Korea. As I mentioned, under a liberal constitutional form of government that is non-nuclear, economically vibrant, and secure and stable. So that is what we should be working towards. The problem is that we're not really working towards that. No one is really working towards that. We are myopically focused on the nuclear program, particularly from the U.S. perspective. South Korea is focused on peace, which is a good thing, and they believe that they can achieve peace and then work towards unification. But all of that is fraught with danger because we don't know what is happening inside the North. And of course, tomorrow, I ask this of policymakers a lot. What if you learn today that Kim Jong-un was no longer alive? What action would we take? And I know what the action is. Well, we'll wait and see what happens. Nobody has thought through the plan, or that nobody that I know of has thought through the plans, to deal with what comes after Kim Jong-un. But really, success will not come until we get past Kim Jong-un. And really, for me, the only logical outcome is unification. And that is something we should be helping our blood ally, South Korea, work towards.
So when we talk about success, what does success look like here? I think here we have to try to distinguish between, I echo the first point, which is no war in the peninsula, because I'm not sure who that's a success for. If there's, widespread loss of life in the area, and also the threat of a massive escalation in regards to China, use of nuclear weapons, things like this. This would make the world unrecognizable from what we've lived in for the last 80-odd years. I think here for Korea, for South Korea, success would be maintaining its security on terms that it's comfortable with. So if it wanted the United States to leave, and it felt that in leaving it was not going to become subject to North Korean power, but I think here also more generally Chinese power, right, Chinese influence, that would be one of the kind of more broad nebulous issues here for South Korea. Then, if that's what they want, then they should be allowed to have that.
And we will leave.
Yeah.
If they say yes, we will leave.
It's not the United States' choice to stop that.
That's right.
I think for the U.S. here, going forward, I think we're entering, you guys are, know this, you're aware of this probably in your classes, you're entering a period of extraordinary change. We're about to go into something approaching a multipolar system for the first time in 80 years, and we've forgotten a lot of the things about how that operates, I think, and it's not as simple as balance, balance, balance. There's a lot, it's a more complicated form of politics. And I think here with the United States, I'm personally of the position here, it's in the United States' strong interest to maintain the system that has been in position for the last few decades as long as it can, because it essentially acts as a multiplier on US power throughout the system. The longer the institutional order can survive, the stronger the United States is in the world. The longer the United States can maintain its regional influence, the stronger the United States in the world. And for what it's worth, the better it is for the world. Because I think that, I still perhaps naively subscribe to something of mountain to the city on the hill. If there's going to be 3 major powers in the system, China, maybe Russia, not really, but certainly China, and the United States, well then thank God one of them is a democracy. That's a start. And so a success here would be the United States is able to help maintain peace and security in that region without having to give up the order that it's helped build in the world. I think that's essentially what it has been doing for the last few years, and I think any policy that maintains that will keep South Korea alive, will keep North Korea bottled up, and it will keep the US's position in the world strong. And I think all of those things would be the success.
I certainly agree with that.
Great, thank you. I know Kevin wants to come up to close, but let me just say in closing, first I want to really thank both of our speakers. Both of our speakers for joining this debate and being so well-spoken and clear and civil on what is, and informed, frankly, on what is probably the most complex topic in American foreign policy. It might not be the most important, but I think it's certainly the most complex and difficult. And so thank you for doing that. Congratulations to the American University chapter of AHS for really launching what I think is a phenomenal first event. Really a great attendance, and thank you for all of you for being here. It's I'm going to sound like an old fogey, and I'm not that much older than most of you. Don't let the bald head fool you, but it's really enlightening and inspiring to see a lot of young people who actually care about the future of American foreign policy and America's role in the world. I think for for many years, I think it's often difficult to find people who want to study and learn history, international relations, so on. When I know a lot of people might be more interested in going to computer science and mechanical engineering. There may be more jobs in that way, I agree, but if the world goes off the rails the way all of us seem to think it is, great, trust me, there'll be a lot of jobs in this arena as well. So with that, Kevin, if you want to say a few words about AHS at AU and maybe next events, but really thank you, all of you, for making this such a great event.
I'd just like to thank our speakers here. It was really it was a great event. You guys are brilliant. It was a great discussion that we had tonight. Also, I would like to say that we have our first general interest meeting for people who are interested in membership or learning more what we're about, our principles, such as the idea of America having a leadership role in the world and things like that. Our general interest meeting is in 1 week. And that's on Tuesday, on the 18th at 7 o'clock p.m. in MGC 245. That's just right up the stairs when you walk in MGC. And also be on the lookout for our next speaker event. That'll take place in the next couple of weeks, and we'll of course market that in the same ways that we did this one because turnout was so good. And I promise that we will have more food next time. We were so successful that we didn't quite expect it, but thank you all again for being here.
Thank
you.
What birthday? What?
Hey, thank you.
Oh.